Okay, so Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this event brought to you over Facebook Live and indeed over Zoom. And it's brought to you by FMO, the Federation of Muslim Organisations in Leicester, by the City Retreat, also based in Leicester, and the British Islamic Medical Association, otherwise known as BIMA. So we've all seen COVID-19 really wreak havoc across our communities. We'll all know people who've been affected by the virus. Sadly, many of us will know people who've passed away from the virus. I'm sure we've all lost loved ones and those close to us. We'll know other people suffering from long COVID. We've seen businesses close. We've seen people become unemployed or go onto furlough. And very sadly, I think for the community, we've seen times where our mosques have been closed, our community centres have been closed, and indeed we're still running a very reduced programme at many of our mosques across the country and indeed here in Leicester. So against the backdrop of all of that, we've now had a very exciting announcement around a vaccine. Pfizer have announced a vaccine that has been approved and it has started to be rolled out across the UK. It throws up a number of really important questions for us here as Muslims and as a faith community. Is the vaccine permissible to take? Is it safe? Does it really contain pig-based ingredients? Does it contain fetal cells? What is my duty as a Muslim? Should I take the vaccine or should I just let others take it and I'll be okay? To explore all of this and to lift the lid on this very important question, I'm really pleased to be joined here by three esteemed panelists from the Leicester community. We have Abdul Karim from the FMO, who will be known to many of you as a beloved uncle and as a community leader who has served our communities and led the FMO for a number of years. Abdul Karim is a retired academic. He is chairman of the FMO, also of Masjid Al-Falah, and he is here in the capacity as a community leader to share some of his thoughts and experiences around COVID and thoughts also around the vaccine. Welcome and Assalamu alaikum to Abdul Karim. We're also joined here by Shaykh Shafi from the City Retreat. Shaykh Shafi is known to many of us as our dear local imam, as somebody who's very special and one of our teachers here in the community. So welcome to Shaykh Shafi.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And last but never least is Dr. Fasih Khan, a respiratory physician, which is another way of saying he works as a doctor here in the hospitals in Leicester, also pursuing a PhD in medical research based on respiratory medicine and a very active member and a leader of the community at BIMA. Welcome and Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Fasih. So it'd be fabulous really to hear from the panelists on a number of themes. I'm going to start by talking about COVID. So we've heard a number of things about COVID. It's really just an exaggerated flu, all the way through to it being one of the most deadly things that we've come across, certainly in our lifetimes. Abdul Karim, I just want you to spend a bit of time talking to us about how COVID has impacted the communities that you serve. What are you seeing across Leicester and what has been the impact of the coronavirus in the work that you do?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think you have in your introduction already pointed out that this global pandemic has created a global crisis and not a single household in the city or in the county or elsewhere has remained unaffected by the pandemic. Obviously, the faith community in Leicester, you have already actually listed few things in terms of the impact on the individual families, but I think I will also talk about some of the impacts that was made actually on the community. Going back to March 2020, when the news started coming through about the pandemic, and then subsequently the mosques were closed. I mean, I think that was the biggest disruption that I think the Muslim community had to experience actually. But having said that, I would say that at individual levels, the families as well as the community tried to be, on one hand, extremely resilient, high level of compliance with the guidance and regulations that was put forward by the government, and very optimistic and full of patience. And for community leadership, as I have always maintained, it was a continuously balancing, on one hand, the welfare and the well-being of the individuals as well as the community, and on the other hand, meeting the spiritual Islamic needs of the Islamic daily routines. And I think we, alhamdulillah, would say that masajid in general in the city and in the county and in fact all over the country have actually remained, I would say, very high level of compliance on one hand, and on the other hand, tried to be creative in terms of actually offering the facilities that was required once the mosques were reopened.
Sure.
During the closure of the mosque, I wouldn't say that the mosques were redundant. I think most of us actually tried to relay our regular talks and bayans and programs and salah from the mosque through our own radio systems and the relaying systems. At the same time, the madrasas became very creative and started offering online teachings and online education. So there was quite a bit of learning as well.
Sure.
On the positive side, I think we should actually count those positive developments. So for instance, if you talk about the individual families, I would say that last Ramzan, when the masajids were closed and when there was no iftar and iftar gathering and the salat in the masjid, a friend of mine actually said that after 20 years, he had his first iftar with his wife at home. Wow. Now, I said on one hand, yes, it is disappointing, hugely disappointing for you not to have the iftar in the masjid. But on the other hand, look at the positive, that it helped him to be with his family at iftar time. And rather than having iftar with the friends in the masjid, they're having iftar with the family at home. I have heard about the young huffaz, young children who are huffaz of Quran, leading Taraweeh for the family members in their home. So I would say that yes, on one hand, it was quite disruptive. It was hugely disappointing. But on the other hand, if you look at the positive sides of it, it actually offered lots of other alternatives. Sure. I would say that when the City Retreat talks about, some of the masajid actually started setting up the support centers, the food banks, and trying to provide the counseling services. So in general, I would say, yes, alhamdulillah, that balance of looking after the community and the welfare and the well-being of the community on one hand, and on the other hand, meeting the spiritual needs was very well maintained.
Thank you. That's a really good overview. And I think it really summarizes why we're here today, to look after the community, to impart some information so people can make informed choices about the vaccine and do the right things for themselves, their families, and the communities that they're in. Sheikh Shafi, can just hand over to you there. You are the Imam at the City Retreat. I know personally I've really missed some of the classes that we were running there in person during the lockdown. It's been restricted at times since then as well. I guess a key question for me would be, is the coronavirus real, right? Is it a bit of exaggeration? Is it a bit of an overreaction? Have we kind of closed things down unnecessarily? Or is there a real threat to safety and indeed to life?
Okay, so that's straight into the deep end. Thank you for that, Imran. Is it
You're welcome.
real? I mean, really, pandemic or plandemic, all sorts of things have been bandied around from March, from the very outset, from the time that the country started. There were some people who were saying the government's not doing enough, we should have closed down already, schools should have shut down, whilst others were saying this isn't happening, it's not real. I think we got to a point when enough of us began to experience firsthand, as Abdul Karim was saying, within our own families, within our communities, of people falling sick, in some cases desperately sick, and being hospitalized and needing help with breathing. And then the spike in janazas. And every now and again, you hear about people coming still out with the idea that actually, no, there hasn't been an increase in deaths, and there hasn't been, and there isn't. I mean, just take a look around at the community. Anyone who's involved at a community level, just as a subsection of the community, the Muslim community, the Muslim cemeteries and funeral services up and down the country have reported just how crippling the impact of the spikes in funeral services, in not being able to be with loved ones in their final moments, and the toll that that's taken on so many of us. So while for the vast majority of us, of course, it's a relatively mild affair to contract COVID. I've had COVID, my wife has, my mum has. There are many other people who aren't quite so fortunate to be able to just say, it was an experience we had and now we're past that. I know personally of many, many people from within my own fraternity of fellow imams and ulama up and down the country, but also within our communities, in Leicester, in London, in various parts of the country. And so, you know, really, it is something that I think we can't afford to not take seriously. The Prophet of Allah said that the believer is the person who doesn't allow himself to be stung from the same hole twice. So whilst people may have been excused initially for a degree of skepticism and not being sure, anyone who's still going on about, you know, and really banding alternate narratives to the idea that at the heart of it, we are faced with a global situation, a global pandemic that has claimed lives of many thousands and thousands of people around the globe, and it's brought communities, families, whole, you know, industries to their knees. Anyone who's really still, you know, promoting something else at this stage, they're being very irresponsible and flying in the face of what anecdotally, let alone officially, people can observe.
I think that's really interesting, and certainly hearing your experience as an imam and with your colleagues up and down the country experiencing an increase in requests for funeral arrangements and support in the communities. That's really quite striking. I mean, I've been very fortunate that, you know, my family members have been well, but I have friends who have lost parents and grandparents very sadly. And of course, we do pray for all of those who have passed away. May Allah grant them Jannah. Dr. Fasih, I'm going to come to you now. We're hearing there really from an imam's perspective, from a societal perspective, the increase anecdotally and through the data in the number of funerals, the number of hospital admissions. Now, you work in the hospitals here in Leicester. You are on those wards. You're dealing with COVID patients. Tell us, what's that like? And in particular, what's it like at the moment?
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for asking me, inviting me here today. Look, I work across all three hospitals in Leicester. I've born in Leicester, trained in Leicester, been working in Leicester for 15 years. It's been an incredibly tough year, and that would not be an understatement. When this all began, as Shaykh Shafi alluded to, we had a number of individuals who said, this is just the flu. This is just a severe flu. And actually, this will pass, and we're over-exaggerating. And I think to myself sometimes, where does this come from? You know, where is this narrative coming from? I think if you are one of those fortunate people where you don't know somebody in your family or your extended family or your neighborhood who's had COVID and suffered from COVID, then count yourself very lucky, because mashallah, you are in the minority. Wow. What I've seen in the hospitals throughout the year has been incredibly difficult, physically challenging, emotionally challenging, psychologically challenging. And what makes it even more difficult is the end is not in sight. So we had the first wave, of course, earlier in the year, where our hospitals coped admirably. We did really well. We had a number of patients who had COVID, but we coped. We then went through a period through the summer, August, September, October, where the numbers were quite low. But in the last 2 months, what we have really seen, and this is not just in Leicester, this is across the country, talking to my fellow colleagues, we have seen a surge in cases. We have seen the wards, I mean, a chest physician, as you alluded to, at Glenfield, the wards at Glenfield are full of COVID. A number of new wards have been opened up. We have challenges because we have nobody to staff these wards. We have challenges because the intensive care units are now filling up. There are not enough ventilators. Oxygen is running out in hospitals. This is not a myth. This is not something that somebody has just made up because it makes good reading or it sounds good. This is the reality on the ground. And, you know, we're in that situation now where we are desperate. We're desperate that something will change. You know, everybody's absolutely fed up. I was talking to a colleague just recently, a couple of days ago. I've not been in the hospital for a couple of weeks at Glenfield, so I was just catching with what the latest is. And actually, I'm told that almost 2/3 of patients with COVID who are currently in hospital are from a Bain background. Disproportionate. Clearly, our communities are being affected. And I think it hurts me. It really hurts me, because whilst vaccine hesitation is entirely understandable, and we're going to come on to this, and asking the questions and understanding this is really important, I think denying the existence of COVID is a big problem. It's a huge problem. Okay. It exists. I've seen people die. I've seen elderly people die on their own because relatives aren't allowed in hospital because of, you know, restrictions on visiting. It's really difficult.
It's really difficult actually hearing some of that, you know, elderly people dying on their own without their family members present, not having the full kind of funeral as they might ordinarily do. It must be very difficult for people, you know, to have closure and deal with that from a mental health perspective as well. That's just hearing about it. To actually go through that as a lived experience must be incredibly difficult for those who passed away, those who are ill, and indeed those like yourself, Dr. Fasih, working on the ward rounds. I should have said at the start, we're going to sort of talk until around 8 o'clock, and I'm going to put some questions to the panel on the vaccine and really get into some of the detail from a religious, a community, and a medical perspective. But we do also want to open this up and give the audience or the participants an opportunity to raise questions. So I think the ways in which you can do that are by putting your question in the chat box on the Zoom facility. If you're on Facebook Live, please put your question in the comments box there. We do have a team working behind the scenes who will coordinate those questions and help to put those to the panel. So please feel free to post the questions as we go through the talk. We will come to those at the end. So we've really heard in no uncertain terms that COVID is real. People are dying. Imams are busier than ever. Doctors are really struggling. We then have the dawn of the vaccine. It has now arrived. It has been approved. It has been rolled out. It is being rolled out as we speak. Abdul Karim, I want to come to you first. There are a number of reports, and we're seeing a number of things out there on social media, in the public domain, that quite large portions of our community, quite a few people, are concerned about the vaccine. They say they will refuse to take the vaccine. We're hearing stories that people have already refused to take the vaccine. Why do you think people are so reluctant to take the vaccine when we're hearing that people are dying and we're hearing that imams are very busy with funerals for those who have died from COVID?
Right. With a very positive mindset, I would say actually that yes, there is a bit of a reluctance actually in terms of accepting that the vaccine exists and it will benefit us. Mainly for the reason that the illness itself was new. The vaccine itself is also new. Yes, definitely, I would say that the healthy skepticism and a critical thinking and critical analysis would be very helpful, and I'm not against it at all. The problem is some of the material with ill information or false information that is being circulated on the social media platforms creates doubts actually in the minds of few people, I would say, not all. I would say that the large majority are accepting the fact that it's now available, and that if you look at some of our national organizations like the Muslim Council of Britain, the MINAB, the BIMA, and the BBSI, and many local groups and local masajid and local organizations have endorsed actually quite clearly that it is safe, that it is not haram, and that it is something that we should accept as a preventative measure. It is a preventative measure, and I think that should be accepted. Unfortunately, sorry,
Abdul Karim. So just pausing there, you've referenced a number of organizations, the MCB, MINAB, BIMA, BBSI. just taking a local view on that, you're here from the FMO, we have Sheikh Shafi here from the City Retreat. What is your advice from the FMO and from yourself as somebody of the community? Are you advising people to take this vaccine?
I would say in no uncertain terms that we have recommended and we would advise. Based on our analysis from and based on the information that we have received from the reliable sources, based on the advice that and rulings that we have received from the acceptable known scholars, and based on the advice that we have received from our Muslim professionals, I would say
Sure.
we would definitely recommend it.
I think that that's very clear. And the thing I want us all to consider, especially those from the Leicester community, is, you know, these are very esteemed colleagues here from the community sharing advice and information with us. There's no agenda here. There's no, you know, sort of alternative outcome people are looking for. Abdul Karim, we all know as an uncle, as a community leader who has dedicated his life to serving this community. I've only been in Leicester a short while myself, but I've come across FMO and the work that Abdul Karim is leading on. That work has always been with the community interest at heart. And I think the advice we're hearing very clearly from Abdul Karim is also with the community interest absolutely paramount. Sheikh Shafi, I want to come to you now. Abdul Karim mentioned, and I think he referred to a number of things going through social media, going through sort of the public domain. A lot of things are being authored by people without any particular credentials, any background in the religious sciences, the medical sciences, epidemiology, public health. It seems to be a lot of people kind of speaking from their own perspective. I guess before we get into the detail of some of that, the question I would put to you is, as Muslims, as members of a faith community, what are our responsibilities in accessing information and sharing information? How do we go about making sure that we inform ourselves and others in an accurate and fair way?
Okay, now that's a really important question, and this cuts to the nub of one of the more crucial pandemics that we've been exposed to. I'd say perhaps even more than the viral one is the misinformation one, the pandemic of false facts, fake news, misinformation that spreads like wildfire, that people are uncritically passing on via WhatsApp and social media, whatever else we use to. And this is something that, as you say, as a faith community, we have a tradition which 14 centuries ago lay the greatest emphasis on verification. Know what you're talking about before participating in its proliferation. This is a really big deal for us as Muslims, because the God we worship, one of his many names, is Al-Haq, the true. And the Quran says, مَاذَا بَعْدَ الْحَقِّ إِلَّا الضَّلَالِ. What is there after truth apart other than falsehood? What is there if you leave aside that which is true, that which is verifiable, that which is based on a solid foundation, other than dhann, which is conjecture and speculation and people's making all sorts of summations? And it's not a healthy way to go about life. So the Quran, in fact, Surah An-Nisa, Allah Azza wa Jalla in Surah An-Nisa in verse 83 says, makes a very, this is almost addressing the you know, endemic spread of false news. Allah says, وَإِذَا جَاءَهُمْ أَمْرٌ مِّنَ الْأَمْنِ وَالْخَوْفِ أَذَاعُوا بِهِ. There are people, whenever they come across any news, either to do with security or to anything that induces fear, immediately they broadcast it. أَذَاعُوا بِهِ. 14 centuries ago, the Quran speaking about broadcasting news without checking. And then Allah says, وَلَوْ رَدُّوهُ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ وَإِلَى أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْهُمْ لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ. Had they but referred this news, this very concerning information that deals with public security or deals with matters of fear and safety, had they referred those to the correct authorities, in the first instance to the messenger, to those entrusted with knowledge, لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ, those whose job it is to verify and get to the truth of the matter could have known, could have come to know its truth, and then presented the facts away from the fiction for the community. So the Quran has now the Prophet of Allah said, it's enough to make you a liar that you pass on, relay everything that you've heard. It's one of the hadiths of Muslim, very authentic. It's enough for you to be considered a liar that you hear information and uncritically pass it on. And it's not good enough to say, well, I'm just forwarding it. And there's a lot of people who do this early on. And again, there are legitimate, I want to be clear, as an imam, as a community person, we're not on any pharmaceuticals payroll. We're not being sponsored by any conglomerate or government or anybody else out there. There may be absolutely legitimate concerns about any number of medicinal practices, and those can be vaccines, and in fact, most of the medicine in your medicine cupboard will have a list as long as your arm of side effects, of things to be wary of. And if you notice any of these side effects, discontinue immediately and reach your GP or get medical advice. So that's always there. But there are people who are claiming on the one hand that somehow a vaccine, in this case, the COVID vaccine, purports to be 100% effective and never have no chance of any side effects or ill consequences, and therefore will then say, but look, there's some X, Y, and Z have published and have demonstrated there may be this concern or that concern, and so it's terrible, don't take it. Actually, there's something very nefarious at play, and something very evil and dubious is being done to your community. And for me, this is very dangerous. And I'll just end on this one an authentic hadith, again related by Bukhari Muslim. The Prophet of God says, a man will lie, إن المرء لا يزال يكذب حتى يكتب عند الله كذابا. A person will be untruthful, ويتحرى الكذب, and go out seeking untruths until he becomes written down before God as a liar. And seeking untruths is very interesting to me, because we've noticed now there are people who will wade through published material, stuff that's in the public arena, and find the one snippet of information by means of which they then seek to cast aspersions on the entire medical industry, on every GP and nurse and practitioner and the industry at large, and say, look, they're all actually something very terrible. And yet, if you just read the rest of the paragraph, if you read the entirety of the study, if you read all of the recommendations, it's already been accounted for and been taken into, these things are taken very seriously. The people are going out always seeking the tidbits of almost like, we have nothing better to do in life than to create greater passion.
Sure. So I think what's really powerful for me there is this rich tradition we know from the prophetic community, from the early Muslim communities that you referred to all that time ago, about the responsibility in sharing information. Because once it's shared, you can't unshare that information. That could drive somebody else to take certain actions which may be unsafe for themselves, for their families, or for their communities. And that's really powerful. The one question which has been posed, I think, to many imams is, why are we relying on medication or vaccines? Isn't it all about tawakkul? So is it not about trusting in Allah? Why do we need to trust in science, in Pfizer, in the chief execs who get paid their really nice bonuses when these vaccines are rolled out?
I mean, that's a very good question. So I'm not sure, people who most human beings, most ordinary, sensible, rational people, when they find that actually they're unwell, their family member is unwell, they'll seek medical advice. They'll seek an appointment with their GP. They'll go into A&E or the walk-in clinic or phone 111 or wherever it may be. And we do that because we're concerned about it. And we don't say, in fact, the Messenger of Allah taught his part of his tradition is that you tie the camel and then place your trust in God. You don't test Allah by saying you've placed this world. In fact, the Prophet of Allah said, seek remedies and seek a cure, because Allah has not sent down any sickness except there is a dawa, a remedy, a form of medicinal treatment to address it. So go looking for that. Tadawa ibadallah. Seek medicine, and that's from the Sunnah. Now, people who make a specific issue about one method of treatment, this one vaccine, really haven't explained why it is that they still reach for the paracetamol when they have a headache, why their, aunt still gets a hip replacement when she needs one, why their wives are still getting the epidural when they're giving birth. All of this stuff's happening all the time. We rely on modern medicine, and we don't think for a moment that this is an entire industry of people that we're placing ourselves into the hands of, who are basically psychopaths out to do us harm or kill us. And yet in this one instance, we've somehow allowed ourselves to believe doctors and nurses who are on the front line of getting the vaccine themselves are doing something to cause widespread harm to everybody. And again, that's not to say that there aren't risks. This is always a risk,
sure.
And this is what medics do. And it's because of the transparency that we know about groups of individuals who need to be careful, who doctors will themselves will advise aren't to be taking the vaccine at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of the transparency of the procedure. But the idea that there's widespread harm that's being sought against people is very, there's a cognitive dissonance at play.
Sure. No, thank you. I mean, what I really took from that is that taking medication is clearly a sunnah, as you've said. So I'm going to bring Fasih, Dr. Fasih Khan back in here at this point to really focus a bit more on the medical aspects of the vaccine. I can see questions are coming in through the Zoom platform, also on Facebook. They are being collated in the background. We will get to those at the end of this session. So Dr. Fasih Khan, if you just come off mute, excellent, thank you. So we're going to focus now on the Pfizer vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is the vaccine that has been approved for use here in the UK. It's the one that's been rolled out. People have already taken it. So just to be absolutely clear, some of the questions that I want to talk through with you now will be based on the Pfizer vaccine. There clearly are other vaccines being developed by the likes of AstraZeneca and Oxford, and I think the questions would have to be re-examined for those vaccines. And just to be absolutely clear with the audience here, what the purpose of this conversation is. So, Fasih, one of the questions I would put to you is, vaccines normally take 10 years to develop and to pass the appropriate safety tests and to roll out. The Pfizer vaccine has been rolled out in 10 months. So can a vaccine of this nature really be developed in 10 months?
I think it's a great question. And I think this is the question that is making a lot of people uneasy. As you very correctly said, historically, it's taken not just 10 years, but sometimes decades to produce a vaccine. And even then, we've not been able to produce a vaccine or one that is actually efficacious. I think what we need to understand, so I understand the concerns, how have we produced a vaccine in 10 months? What I hope to do in the next few moments is explain the process and what's been different for this vaccine as opposed to any other vaccine in the past. So the first thing to say, this is a new technology. This is an mRNA technology, okay? And when I say new, it's not completely new because it's been used in other vaccines that are in development, but it's a technique, a technology which has probably been around for about the last decade or so. This technology has been developing in the background. So when the SARS-CoV-2 virus hit in December last year, in January, the Chinese were able to sequence the virus and give us the code. That, from there to producing the vaccine, wasn't a difficult job. It was something that was really easy and straightforward.
Okay, this is naturally going to be a bit technical because I think I'm asking some very pertinent questions about the vaccine, but I just want to pause there for a moment. I think what I'm hearing is we weren't starting from scratch, that there was a lot of work that was already done on mRNA, and that work, which was being done in the background on other vaccines, on other projects in development elsewhere, provided a basis. So we were starting from a more advanced position. Have I got that right?
You're absolutely spot on. So if we were, God forbid, to get another pandemic in a couple of years or in 5 years, if we were to be able to get the genetic code again, it would not take long to produce a vaccine. Okay, so there's two parts to a vaccine being rolled out. The first part is to produce that in the laboratory. That part doesn't take long. That was done very quickly. And actually back in March, April, we had a vaccine that was ready. The second part then is to then roll that out in clinical trials and test how safe is this vaccine? Does it work? What are the effects of it? Can people take it? All of these things. Now, historically, always with any medicinal product, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a tablet, whether it's any injection, there's a huge amount of bureaucracy. Okay, I run a clinical trial here in the UK, and before we can start the project, we have to go to an ethics committee. An ethics committee is independent. They look at what are you giving the patients, what dose are you giving the patients, how are you going to monitor for adverse effects, how are you going to collect the data, how are you going to analyze the data, who's going to work on the project, what conflicts of interest are there, and so forth. Every little thing is scrutinized. Now, normally that process can take months, but because the world has been on standstill, all of the energy was put into approving the processes. That does not mean that shortcuts were taken. What it meant is that everybody came together and focused on all of these things so we could progress. The second most really important thing to understand is funding. So the way it works is you normally have 3 phases to any medications. You have phase 1, you demonstrate, is it safe? At that point, you then analyze the data, you apply for more money. That process of applying for funding can take many months or years. And this is not just, £100,000, 1 million, this is billions of pounds we're talking. We had huge injections of money put into a number of vaccines, not just in the Pfizer vaccine, into a number of vaccines. So with the funding, with the efficiency, with everybody working together, lots of different organizations coming together, we were able to streamline this. When I say we, I talk about the medical community, not me individually, and trials will run in parallel rather than sequentially. That does not, however, mean that corners were cut. And that's really important to understand. In testing the vaccine, in producing the vaccine, yes, there are problems, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but corners were not cut.
Sure. So if I can summarize that in perhaps a bit sort of non-medical language, we're saying we had a bit of a head start because lots of other work had been done already, even before this pandemic landed. And then because it affected so many people across the world, I mean, virtually, I think every country went into lockdown, business was impacted, people at government level were impacted. We were able to speed up some of the formal processes, and actually funding was not an issue. What I understand from some of those in the science and vaccine community is very often they make progress and then they have to stop for 6 months because they don't get the next round of funding. And then they have to start again, and then they have to stop. And it's a continuous cycle of start and stop. It sounds to me as if that hasn't happened here. There has been so much interest globally because this impacts every human being on Earth, that start-stop process was actually replaced by something which just went from start to finish without any break in that process. Is that a fair summary?
I mean, those that invested in the vaccine took a risk because the Pfizer vaccine was not the only one that was invested in. A number of other vaccines also had a lot of investment put into them, and they've probably, and some of those were dropped later. So the funders took a risk.
Sure.
And normally, of course, they wouldn't be able to do that, and they wouldn't do that for obvious reasons.
Okay, I can see more questions coming in on the chat box. Please do continue with those, and we will come to those at the end. Firstly, I want to stay on this theme of safety, though. I think there are a number of questions certainly on my mind. The Pfizer vaccine, I believe, was only tested on 20,000 people. Now, we live in a global population which is getting closer to 8 billion. So is 20,000 people really enough of a sample to know what's going on with this vaccine, the potential side effects, the potential safety issues? Or have we just fast-tracked this so much that we're now all exposed to potential safety issues if we were to take the vaccine?
Sure. I think, so 20,000 in the context of a clinical trial is still a very large number. Okay, 20,000 people is a huge number. So let me just talk a little bit about the study. So this is specifically about the Pfizer study that we're talking about. 40,000 people were included in the study, of which 20,000 received the vaccine and 20,000 received placebo, which is essentially just an injection of water. these patients were then followed up for 14 weeks at least. Okay, so at least 2 to 3 months each. And the number of side effects was measured. The efficacy, so how effective the vaccine is, was also recorded. And then the data came out. Now, 20,000, you're right, in the global context of 8 million seems like a very small number. But from a clinical trial perspective, for testing a medication, is actually a very decent sample size.
So let me just, sorry, Dr. Fasih, let me pause you there. So are there other medications that people in the community are taking, have taken for years, that were only tested on 20,000 people before they became...
The majority of medications, so if we look at the cancer medications, we look at most of the medications that we take, the antibiotics, the painkillers, they would have been tested on a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand.
Sorry,
so
let me just pause there. You're saying the antibiotics that we take, other medications that we take, would have only been tested in some cases on a few hundred people, not even 20,000.
Correct. And so this puts this into context. So when we say that 20,000 is only 20,000 people, we have to realize this is 19,500 more than probably most other tests for other medications. This is a very large number. Now, in an ideal world, and this is what we have to say, what do we know, what would we ideally want to know? We would want a bigger sample size. Of course we would. This is a vaccine which eventually will vaccinate most of the world's population. So in an ideal world, we'd probably want 50,000, 60,000, okay? But to say that it's only been tested in 20,000, I think is probably off the mark. Now, going back to your question about safety, what we saw in the study, so the other important point that I want to make is when Pfizer did their press release back in November, my first response was, until I've seen the data, I don't believe it. Until I have scrutinized the data, I don't believe it, okay? So it was only after the data was published and we scrutinized it and sat down and looked at this independently, we came up with conclusions. But if you look at the study, and this is available online, this is not a secret. I mean, obviously it's medically written, so there may be some jargon there which is, needs interpretation. But if you look at the 20,000 who got the vaccine and the 20,000 who received the placebo, the rate of adverse events. Now, an adverse event is what? Fatigue, headache, fever, common side effects after any vaccine was similar in both groups. It was about 0.5%, 0.5% in both groups. Okay, so there was no evidence to suggest, there was nothing to suggest that the short-term safety, the 2.5 to 3 month safety data, was any different in those that received the injection and those that just got a water injection. What about deaths? We had 2 deaths in the 20,000 that received the vaccine, and 4 deaths in those that received the saline injection, okay? And none of those 6 deaths, 2 and 4, were thought to be related to the vaccine itself, okay? So I am reassured that the short-term safety data looks extremely good, and there were no side effects that make me think, my goodness, we need to worry here. Where is the limitation? And I said, we've got to be honest here and say what we know and what we don't know.
Okay, so let me just make that real for a moment. You clearly look at data day in, day out. Most of us don't do that, certainly not in a medical context. You're pursuing a PhD in respiratory medicine. You've shown me some of your data sets over time. It's not meant very much to me at all, if I'm absolutely honest. It means a lot to you. Having seen the data for this vaccine and all of the safety issues that we've just talked about, would you be advising your 84-year-old father to take this vaccine?
Most certainly. My dad has had the vaccine last week. I have had the vaccine. And my advice to others would be to take the vaccine. Absolutely. And so I'm putting my money where my mouth is. And as I said, I've had the vaccine the week before last, and my father had it last week. So going back to the safety, where there is some legitimate concern is the long-term safety of the vaccine. So typically with a vaccine, we would follow up patients for at least a year, 2 years, and probably even longer, 5 to 10 years, before we can say that this vaccine has no long-term side effects. What we don't know is what the long-term safety data is going to look like. So whilst I can reassure everybody listening in here today that the short-term safety is excellent and I'm fully reassured, I can't give the same reassurance for the long-term safety. However, what I can say, based on my medical background and experience with other medications, is your side effects tend to be in the first few weeks. With any medication, you tend to get your side effects in the first few weeks.
Yep.
And therefore, on the balance of probabilities, it is likely to be safe in the long term. But if somebody has those concerns, they are legitimate concerns. They are legitimate concerns.
I think that's a really, sorry, Dr. Fasih, to talk across you, but I think that's a really important point. It's very valid to have concerns and to ask questions. I think just going back to the point Sheikh Shafi and Abdul Karim made earlier, it's about going to the right sources and going to the right people of knowledge, experts in that field, to provide the answers to the questions that are being raised. Dr. Fasih, I'm going to ask one final question on safety, and I really want to then move on to ingredients of the vaccine and bring Sheikh Shafi and Abdul Karim back into the discussion to talk about the Islamic permissibility of the vaccine. But just on safety, we're hearing some stories that some people have taken the vaccine and gone into anaphylactic shock. Now, again, I'm not a medic. I don't really know what that means. I certainly can't spell it. What is anaphylactic shock? What's going on there? Why are people having these reactions? And therefore, should you not be concerned about your 84-year-old father?
So anaphylaxis is essentially a severe allergic reaction.
Okay.
And in anaphylaxis, this can be secondary to a number of things, which can include foods, can include medications, can include things like wasp and bee stings. Okay, and we've all heard of allergic reactions to foods and so forth. Anaphylaxis is a severe enough allergic reaction where you struggle to breathe and you have other side effects, and you usually need an injection of adrenaline or something else. Now, there's a couple of points here that are really important for me to highlight. Your risk of having anaphylaxis following a vaccine has been demonstrated to be about 1 in 1 million. Okay, so a very low risk. You are more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to have anaphylaxis after having a vaccine. And actually, the risk of having an allergy, so if you look at data in America, about 10% of the population have severe allergic reactions to penicillins and other antibiotics that we all take. However, again, this is a legitimate concern. The concern here is that those that have severe allergic reactions need to be cautious, because there have been cases of people having allergic reactions. And therefore, the advice has been updated by the MHRA and internationally that those with severe allergic reactions to food, vaccines, or medications should not take the vaccine, because the risk in their particular case outweighs the benefit of the vaccine. Okay, and that's something that we need to understand. So my job here as a doctor, and our job in the profession, is to weigh everything up. Everything is benefit. The risk of taking something versus the benefit.
I'm going to pause you there, Dr. Fasih, because we will come on to that, and I'm very keen to hear from the other panelists on how we assess risk from a medical and a religious perspective. But just to go on to the contents now of the vaccine, there's been a lot written about this. There's a lot in circulation. I'm going to ask you some very blunt questions. First one, does the vaccine contain any animal cells, any gelatine, or any other animal-based ingredients? Remember, just the Pfizer vaccine we're talking about.
The Pfizer vaccine does not contain any animal or human cells. There's no gelatine, there's no pig-based ingredients. Categorically, absolutely not. And that's a myth, and that's misinformation for those that are saying that it does.
We're also hearing a lot of noise about fetal cells. Does the Pfizer vaccine contain fetal cells or any other human cells of any kind?
Again, this is misinformation. The Pfizer vaccine is mRNA, it's synthetic material. It does not require any fetal cells. It does not contain any human animal cells at all. So no.
Okay. And can you describe, so one of the things which is sort of in circulation is, don't take this vaccine, it will change your DNA, right? Now, again, DNA, what does that really mean? What is it? Can it really be changed? Can the vaccine have the power and the ability to do that? Can you just talk us through that? Start with what is DNA, and then perhaps move on to whether this vaccine can alter somebody's DNA.
So again, I understand these concerns. I mean, we've got a new vaccine. We're talking about genetic code. People are, we live in this world where there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of mistrust, and people are saying, this is going to alter my DNA. And I can see where these concerns are coming from. Our DNA is essentially our genetic code. Okay, it's like a recipe book. It holds the instructions for making all the proteins in our body, whether that's our hair color, whether that's our eye color, the shape of our nose, the shape of our ears, how tall we are, whether we develop medical problems. It contains all our genetic code. And this is passed down from our parents from generation to generation, okay?
So in very simple terms, DNA is what makes you Dr. Fasih, it's what makes me Imran, and what makes Sheikh Shafi, and we're all different, right?
Indeed. Indeed, it's the recipe book for all the proteins in our body. It's our genetic code. And so, as you asked, one of the concerns is that the mRNA will alter our DNA. I mean, again, it's a baseless allegation. It's scientifically flawed. I don't want to get too technical here, but I'm going to try and explain this point. In our body, we have millions of cells, and within our cells, okay, we have a nucleus. The nucleus is the brain of the cell. It normally sits in the middle of the cell. And within that nucleus is where the DNA normally is. When you inject somebody with the mRNA vaccine, that mRNA does not enter the nucleus where the DNA sits. It actually goes in the bit around the nucleus called the cytoplasm. It remains there for a short while, it's disintegrated and it's broken down. It gives the body a signal to produce so it gives the body a signal for a protein to produce antibodies and therefore develop immunity. But that mRNA does not come into contact with DNA and therefore cannot alter the DNA. And for those people suggesting that, unfortunately, that's a reckless allegation. There's absolutely scientifically no possibility.
Okay, so just to be very clear, I think what I took from that is that the vaccine does not interact with the DNA. It cannot alter or change your DNA. There's no scientific basis for that. And that is something that you're confident in putting forward here today.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to turn to Sheikh Shafi for a moment and then Abdul Karim. We've heard quite a bit there on the content of the vaccine, what it contains, what it doesn't contain, potential safety issues. To ask a very simple question, Sheikh Shafi, from an Islamic point of view, is it permissible to take the vaccine? You need to come off mute, Sheikh Shafi, please.
Okay, yes, thank you. In a nutshell, yes. Yes, it is permissible to take the vaccine or to take any medicinal treatment which is designed to give one health and address or treat either an actual illness or one that can be contracted in an environment that you're in. People going for Hajj would get the meningitis jab. People who, our children, when they're very small, there's a reason that we don't see whooping cough in society anymore. We don't see smallpox in society anymore. And we need to be very thankful that we're past that stage. And it's because we're so far past that stage that we've seen outbreaks of really dangerous viral diseases that actually we have the luxury to start postulating about whether or not, and so fundamentally the ingredients, nothing in the ingredients lends to it being haram. Can it be considered, Islamically suspect because we're unsure of what the long-term consequences may be? The Prophet of Allah made there's a very interesting hadith that Abu Dawood and Ibn Majah and others relate. أيما طبيب تطبب ولم يعلم منه طب قبل فهو ضامن. The Prophet of Allah says, any person who practices medicine and is not known for being a practitioner of medicine before this. In other words, he doesn't have a demonstrable qualifications or expertise in the practice of medicine, and then causes harm to others.
he's held accountable by Allah Azza wa Jal, and he's held accountable here on earth. Whereas a person who is an expert, and we have experts in the field who have come together both in microbiology, in respiratory medicine, in various types of disease control and fighting viruses, etc., who are working together in order to try to save or protect the community at large. A lot of people are asking, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun a bit by addressing one of the questions that a number of people have put on the chat, which is, if 90-something% of the population will only suffer very mild impacts of COVID should they contract it, 90-something%, then what need is there? Well, from an Islamic perspective, and I'll speak from the Prophet of Allah said, "La yuridanna mumridun ala musih." Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu narrates this hadith. It's in Bukhari, it's in Muslim, he said, "Let not those who are unwell mingle with those who are healthy." And Abu Hurairah, interestingly, Imam Muslim relates, Abu Hurairah previously would narrate a different hadith, another hadith, which is the hadith that maybe a lot of people have heard of. La adwa wa la tira. There is no contagion, there is no superstition, etc. And then he began to realize that people were taking this hadith in a very literal sense and not exercising exactly what the Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed at the end of that hadith, where he says he's saying that nothing happened, there's no causative link to things except by the will of Allah. We accept that. We accept that eating food and drinking water, ultimately, it's Allah that nourishes. Allah is the Razzaq. It's not the food and the drink in and of itself. But these are asbab. People misunderstood that. The Prophet, right at the end of that hadith, says, وَفِرَّ مِنَ الْمَجْذُومِ فِرَارَكَ مِنَ الْأَسَدِ. Yet, flee from a person who has leprosy, the way that you'd flee from a lion should you encounter a lion. So, because he was concerned, Abu Hurairah is concerned, people are getting the wrong end of the stick of this hadith, he then abandoned narration of that hadith entirely. And this is a companion muhaddith, a companion who narrates hadith, who then took to not mentioning that hadith in public any longer, and in its place would only mention the hadith, let the sick, those who carry contagion, not intermingle with those who are. Now, it may be the case for the vast majority of us, if you contract COVID, it'll be a mild case and then you'll be back on your feet. Maybe you're missing your taste and smell for a period of time. Maybe you'll feel very weak, but then in a couple of weeks, you're back onto your feet again. There are many other people, though, who have died of this. Yes, they may have underlying health conditions. Guess what? Underlying health conditions like diabetes and heart conditions are rife within the Asian community, within the Muslim community, within Bain communities. So unless we're seriously suggesting, there's a lot of people who maybe we don't need to have around the people in our masjids any longer. It's okay if we see lots of them making their way out. And therefore, that's a very cold-hearted thing to suggest. The Prophet of Allah taught that we act as one body. And if one part hurts, then the entirety of the body responds. And the idea of taking the vaccine in order, even though you are at very little risk, minimal risk of doing unduly badly out of it, is not just about your own self. It's not a selfish consideration. It's considering what would happen when you go and interact with an uncle in the masjid, with your grandmother, with your great aunt, whoever. These are people who are very much at risk. And of course, there are many of us we're seeing in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, also with underlying health conditions of various types, who have succumbed.
Sure.
So, we need to be taking this seriously.
Yeah, I think there's some really useful things there to unpack. I think that tradition from Abu Hurairah and that example, again, is a perfect example of the responsibility the companions felt around sharing information that was to be of guidance for others, and the great care that they took to make sure that what they were suggesting, what they were relaying, was not going to be misunderstood or relate to any sort of practice which would bring harm to individuals or collective groups of people. But Sheikh Shafi, I just want to go back to the front end of that question. We heard very clearly from Dr. Fasih, no pig content, no gelatine, no fetal cells. It doesn't alter your DNA. But as an imam who serves a congregation, who has a community at the City Retreat, who stands up at Jummah and delivers the Jummah khutbah, who leads the prayer, do you have any questions unanswered about the Pfizer vaccine in regards to whether it is permissible Islamically?
No, and let me just also say that there are a lot of people who'll be, no, but you know, we've come across some, and again, in our comment section, people say, yes, but you haven't referred to the World Something Association of whoever. Guys, please, again, I began by saying that as a religious duty, we have to check sources. We are religiously required to. And if we genuinely believe that the mainstream industry of medics, of your medical practitioners, the people that you go to when you're having a baby and when you've got heart conditions and when you've got X, Y, and Z, are not to be trusted. The pharmaceutical companies that produce the drugs that, and again, yes, pharmaceutical companies have been mired in great controversy, and ultimately there is a business that's in operation. There is a commercial concern, and you know, but the idea that actually people are deliberately setting about, and the conspiracy theory is always in contradiction with one another. Sometimes it's there is no COVID at all. It's to do with phone masts and 5G, and then it's actually it's population control, and then it's, you know, we're being microchipped through this thing, and then, you know, people's fertility and people's DNA, stuff that scientifically isn't even plausible, like that can't happen. And so people who are spending too much time, if you have a Muslim GP that you can reach out to and sit down and have a conversation with, the same person that you go to when you're feeling unwell and you're concerned about that pain in your chest, they should be the people that we as a community are referring to, rather than anonymous figures. And that's the reason I don't hesitate in saying, from Islamic perspective, it's halal. There are people who still going to say, no, it contains aborted DNA. Where's the evidence for that?
And it's really interesting. I the other day I was drinking a can of Coke, and we were remarking, weren't we, that actually to what extent do we go to checking the ingredients on everything we consume? Now, clearly it's an important topic. As Muslims, we should rightly be concerned about what we're consuming or injecting into our bodies. But what you've heard from Fasih here today, what you've seen in your own research, I'm hearing from you very clearly, Sheikh Shafi, that this is permissible to take. There is no doubt in your mind in regards to the Islamic permissibility of the vaccine.
And can I just add, not only do we have, you know, we're at a point now, it's 2020, not 1980. We are very fortunate to have huge numbers of practicing devout Muslims in medicine, in pharmaceutical industry, in various levels of healthcare. We're very fortunate also to have Muslim scholars, and, you know, much more so than we had maybe 20 years, 30 years ago, who are able to collaborate with medics and with medical professionals. And so we have both BIMA, the British Islamic Medical Association, but also BBSI, the British Board of Scholars and Imams, MINAB, these various other organizations that you've cited, that comprise Salafi and Sufi, Deobandi and Brelvi, from across the board. Now, again, on the one hand, are all of your GPs and nurses and healthcare professionals out to get you? Are all of your imams out to, because there's some person on YouTube who's telling you the truth? And another point I want our community, most of these conspiracy theories are coming from really far-right sources. They're also coming from people who spread the conspiracy that Obama was a Muslim and was introducing Sharia law, and actually there's a cabal of, you know, people in Muslim rape gangs taking place, and the police are complicit in trying to keep it hushed up because they want something. This is coming from the same people who've had too much of the Kool-Aid. Sure. And we need to recognize they're not people who, you know, are reliable or trustworthy for our sources. Yeah, legitimate concerns do exist. Can I also make a very quick point? My mum, Allah bless her with a long and healthy life, was due to have, because of being in a slightly more at-risk category, was due to, in fact, she had an appointment from her GP surgery to have the COVID vaccine. Literally a week ago now, she receives a phone call from her GP practice to say, Mrs. Chowdhury, please don't come in for your vaccine. We've noted, actually, you've got a risk, you've got a history of you know, allergies, and therefore you're considered, you know, potentially more at risk of having a potential adverse event, and so for your safety for the time being. Now, this if anything, it should create further reassurance. It reassures us that actually our medical professionals care about protecting. She was due to have the vaccine. She was told, actually, you're slightly higher risk because X number of years ago, you had a slightly negative reaction to a certain drug, and therefore you're not to come in just yet. Hopefully, further down the line, there may be something that's more suitable for you. We should, this transparency, and conspiracy theorists will pull out the data that the pharmaceuticals themselves are publishing, highlighting adverse effects. One guy in the video literally says, oh, these are irreversible. It doesn't say anywhere in the data that it's irreversible. He just made that up there and then for, without any evidence. And we can't speak in Islam without evidence. You can't do that. If you're going to claim it's irreversible, if you're going to claim that these are people who are now going to be bedbound and paraplegic for the rest of their lives, where there's no evidence. An adverse event can be, as Dr. Fasih said, people get the flu jab or get whatever, and then they feel a bit under the weather for the next couple of days, a bit of a temperature, and then we're back to normal. We're not bedbound forever. You don't get a big disability badge and get to park wherever you like. This is being under the weather. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just conscious of time as well. We are clearly going to run over time here today. I think we perhaps foresaw that as well. I'm going to continue because I think there's so much valuable information that we're discussing here, hopefully circulating. We want to come on to a bit of Q&A as well. But I just want to go to Abdul Karim now. So Abdul Karim, you represent a number of mosques through the FMO. You're chairman at Masjid Al-Falah here in Leicester. Clearly, the permissibility of anything is of great importance to you as a community leader. If you have people approaching you or approaching the imams who lead the prayers in the mosques under FMO, what is your advice to them? Is this vaccine permissible from an Islamic perspective?
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I almost carried away with the debate, actually, that both of you, Dr. Fasih and yourself, and with Shaykh Chowdhury were having. And I think it's covering lots of actually areas which reassures repeatedly in terms of the safety and permissibility of the vaccine. I would say actually that, I think before I go further, I would slightly touch upon what Shaykh Chowdhury talked about, the conspiracy theory. Certain sections of our community is quite vulnerable to these kind of conspiracy theories. It says actually that people who are isolated or people who continue to live with the victim mentality, that they are very easily sort of, receptive of these kind of false information. And there's almost a belief actually that there is a group of people, a powerful group of people exists somewhere who plan secretly the whole plot against the humanity. And, and again, going back to what Shaykh Chowdhury pointed out about how the debate has shifted. Back in January 2020, it wasn't existing. It was artificial. It was part of the biowarfare. And as the March approaches and as it started hitting the home, or close to home, and as we started seeing our own relatives being falling ill and leaving this world, we realized that it is real. And now nobody even talks about it. Then all of a sudden, now, when we talk about the vaccine, it started with obviously the commercial interest. Yes, the pharmaceutical industries are there actually, and they would like to make profit actually. They're not going to do it free of charge. And so, but I think the scientific advancement, and as Dr. Fasih pointed out, because of that existing knowledge, the advancement, the technology that is accessible to us today has made it possible to actually offer this vaccine in a very short period. And I think I maintain very clearly that we should actually consider it positively. And I think what Dr. Shafi pointed out, I had the similar experience where an 85 years old man actually approached me the other day in the mosque. And he was disappointed because his GP rang him to say, don't come for the vaccine because you have the you can give allergic reaction. So what I'm saying is that consult your local ulamas if you don't trust anybody. Consult your local, the health professionals, and decide and make an informed choice. There's absolutely nothing wrong about the critical thinking and healthy skepticism. The problem is about believing in ill information, false information, information without evidence that is being circulated on
Sure.
WhatsApp and social medias. That's where the problems are created. I would say the best option is, having consulted your own religious scholars, go and talk to your own GP, and your GP will be in the best position, looking at the underlying health issues that you have, will advise you whether you should go for it or not. Ultimately, it's your individual choice.
Absolutely, but certainly from a point of view of the contents around gelatine and pig products and fetal cells, you don't have any concerns about these things, having heard from Dr. Fasih, having heard from other imams, other specialists in this area?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm really conscious of time, but really keen to explore some other themes. Dr. Fasih, we've talked a lot about safety. I think that had to be the starting point, but I really want to move on now to effectiveness. So we've heard it's safe. We've heard from Shaykh Shafi and Abdul Karim that it's Islamically permissible. We've heard also that individuals should perhaps go to their own GPs and take very specific advice about their own medical history, their own conditions, and whether it's the right thing for them. Just talk to me a little bit about effectiveness, first of all. How effective is this vaccine?
So when the initial press release in November came out and Pfizer quoted there was 90% effectiveness, I was astounded. We were all astounded. And this goes back to the earlier point, which I think has been made a number of times, and I'm going to make it again. As independent practitioners, we are responsible for the advice that we give. We know that pharma have a track record of bad behavior. And so when the press release was released in November, my first reaction, as some of my colleagues, was we need to look at the data ourselves, because that sounds too good to be true, okay? It sounds too good to be true. Now, in the groups, the effectiveness, the efficacy as we call it, was 95%. So out of the 20,000 individuals who received the vaccine, 8 developed COVID. And then the 20,000 who didn't get the vaccine, 162, the top of my head, around 160, did develop COVID, okay? And that equates to an efficacy, an effectiveness of about 95%. Now, this was similar regardless of your age, whether you were Asian, Caucasian, whether you were male, female, whether you had medical problems. Remarkably successful. So we know that the vaccine was very effective in the clinical trial. Again, what do we not know? We don't know how long that immunity lasts for. Does it last for 3 months? Does it last for 6 months? Does it last for a year? And that data will become available over the next few months. And there are other knowns. Does it prevent transmission? Again, that's something that we don't know. Or does it just prevent you from having severe COVID? But from what we do understand, on an individual level, it is remarkably successful, and it will reduce your risk of developing COVID by 95%, which is staggering. If we remember that the flu vaccine is about 40%, and most of the treatments do not have that kind of high efficacy. So it is very effective based on the data we have currently. And more will become available over the next few months.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. So we've talked for some time now about risk. There are risks clearly in taking the vaccine. We also know there are risks with COVID and contracting the coronavirus. Talk to me more about those relative risks. Is it more risky to take the vaccine, or is it better to not take the vaccine and assume I'll get COVID, but 99% of people get better, so actually I'll be okay? Why should I take the vaccine if 99% of people get better?
I think this is the million-dollar question. Ultimately, the answer, this is an individual choice, okay? I'm not forcing the vaccine upon anybody. Nobody's forcing the vaccine. I've had the vaccine. I've recommended that my family and friends have the vaccine, and everybody knows my position on the vaccine. What are the risks? Well, we've talked about that we don't know the long-term data. We don't have the long-term data, okay? My feeling as a scientist is that the long-term data will be okay, but I can't say that with certainty, okay? That's the first thing. And we also don't know if it prevents transmission and how long the immunity lasts for. What are the risks of not taking the vaccine? We've got to weigh it up. Well, there's risks of having COVID. I have seen people in their 20s, 30s, 40s with no medical problems die from COVID. So if anybody says to me that this is a disease which only affects the elderly with medical problems, false. Yes, percentage-wise, definitely, but I've seen young people die. I have seen a huge number of people who had very mild COVID develop what we call long COVID, where they've got symptoms over many weeks and months, to the extent they're debilitated. They've got fatigue, ongoing breathlessness, chest pain. This is very real. So that's on the individual. If we don't vaccinate the population, the impact on healthcare, we are cancelling operations, we are cancelling routine care, cancer care is being affected, non-COVID admissions are not getting the same kind of level of care because we're just so stretched. Our educational institutes remain closed, our schools and universities, and our education is impacted. Our religious institutes, our mosques, our madaris, they remain closed or they operate minimally. The impact on the economy, people become jobless, homeless, recession continues. Social consequences, we can't see our family. I haven't been to see my parents for 9 months inside their house. We're not able to have weddings with large numbers of guests. Sporting events remain cancelled. A whole long list. So we have to balance everything. In an ideal world, we would want a vaccine which is 100% safe, have all 100% data. We don't have that. We won't have that for a few years. Until we have that data, this is everything we're dealing with if we don't vaccinate ourselves. Vaccinating ourselves as a community, as a population, will allow us to come out of all of these things and for normality to resume and for everything to go back to what it used to previously be like. But that process will take time.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a stark contrast, isn't it? You know, if we don't take this vaccine as a community, we're left to deal with COVID. And I think you articulated beautifully earlier on that actually, if we haven't suffered from COVID or long COVID, if we haven't had family members and friends who've passed away, we're actually very fortunate because there are so many people who have suffered from the virus, who have lost their loved ones. You've gone on to talk about the economy and jobs and the fact that people are really struggling with paying bills and buying food for their family because they suddenly find themselves in a state of unemployment. So clearly coronavirus carries a set of risks, and not taking the vaccine won't address that. It's not suddenly we don't take the vaccine and everything's okay and we just move on magically from this and suddenly things become better. So thank you for explaining that. I think the other point I just wanted to emphasize here, I think all three panelists have been very clear on this. We can't here today talk about anybody's individual medical history or background or their individual suitability for any vaccine. That has to be a discussion between yourself and the medical professionals that you trust, your GP, your doctor. Please do have those conversations. I think the effort we're trying to make here today is really to explain what this vaccine is and what it isn't. We've heard very clearly that from an Islamic perspective, it does not contain any ingredient that would render it impermissible. Shaykh Shafi, Abdul Karim, and Dr. Fasih have all been very clear on this point. It is permissible from an Islamic perspective. The next part of that journey for individuals is to speak to their medical practitioners and their doctors. Firstly, I want to stay with you on one point. You've started to talk about, it's a nice segue into the next part of the conversation, really. You've started to talk about how we sort of move on from coronavirus. If we are vaccinated at a suitable level across the community, hopefully our mosques can open again. Hopefully we can see our family members again. Hopefully we can start to reintegrate back into a fully functioning society, which would be fabulous for us personally, for our mental health, for our employment prospects, so on and so forth. But I just want to focus on herd immunity. It's a phrase that's been used almost from the onset of the coronavirus. It's a phrase that continues to be used in the context of the vaccine. So talk to me in very simple terms. What is herd immunity? How will the vaccine help us to achieve herd immunity? And what might happen if we don't achieve herd immunity?
So herd immunity, very simply, is a specific amount of the population becoming immune, okay? And that's how your pandemic will then die down. There's two ways you become immune, either through having the disease and developing antibodies yourself, or through vaccination. So that's essentially herd immunity. When you have enough people in the population, in the community who are immune, the virus cannot transmit between individuals. So therefore, the reproductive number, the R number, drops and the pandemic dies down. Now, why is this really important? We've already talked about this. There are individuals who cannot take the vaccine. Pregnant women, women who are breastfeeding, children, those with severe allergies. If we as a community don't fulfill our obligation and take the vaccine, we continue. We might be irresponsible on our own part, but we're also irresponsible on them. They cannot take the vaccine because of their medical background or other factors out of their control. And unless we have a certain proportion of the population vaccinated, those individuals remain at high risk. And so the concept of herd immunity is you vaccinate as much of the population as you can. It's usually around 60 to 70%, but that varies per infection. And you then limit the spread of the infection because there's no one to pass it between. And you protect those individuals who are unable to take vaccine in the process.
There's 2 points though there, aren't there? There's the individual risk profile, and there's the how does it spread in society if not enough people are vaccinated. So just to be very clear, there's that sort of individual, if somebody contracts the coronavirus, what impact might it have? What's their age profile? What are their comorbidities? Even if they're young 30-year-olds with no health conditions, they may still suffer from long COVID, they may still suffer fatally from the virus. But from a societal perspective, Dr. Fasih, what I'm hearing very clearly is that if enough of us do not take this vaccine, then we will continue to be at risk ourselves, our parents, our grandparents, our elders in the community, and particularly those with frontline or people facing jobs, including the imams at our mosques. I just want to go on to Shaykh Shafi. Dr. Fasih's described, as I say, very clearly that people have to take this. I think he's describing 60 to 70% for us to achieve immunity as a community and really bring down the risk profile in the virus spreading. Just going back to your earlier comment about our responsibilities to ourselves and our communities as Muslims, can you just talk to me a bit about what that means in the context of herd immunity and taking the vaccine?
So 2020 has been a year of firsts on so many. When was the last time an entire Ramadan went by and you didn't get a step in the masjid once? Attend Taraweeh in congregation once, attend Eid. For many of us, including Leicester Muslims, we didn't get to attend Eid prayers at either Eid. The impact of all of this, and it's only, you know, latterly that we've started with Jumu'ah prayers and with congregational prayers, but with social distancing, with all of these things in place, everyone is desperate to be able to return to some semblance of normality. And not that the vaccine is going to mean that can happen immediately, but it is the path towards being able to return to normality. There are people who, you know, some people are saying things like, oh, we don't want to have we shouldn't be forced to take this. This is we need to have freedom of choice and be able to. No one if there were an agenda to make this a requirement, like a legal requirement, and everyone's going to be compelled to take the vaccine, we wouldn't need to be having this discussion today. It's because we still live in a free society, and ultimately a patient has the right to say that they want to withdraw medical treatment or medical intervention. We live in a society that allows that, so we're having a free discussion. But we have experienced firsthand the cost of COVID, both in our communities, in deaths, in the limitation in being able to attend a masjid, for our kids to be able to attend their madrasa classes, and all of these things. We owe it to ourselves. And Islamically, we care about the greater good. The Prophet of Allah said, the best of people are those who bring about the greatest benefit to people. And it's with that outlook that a Muslim should be willing and you know, hope to be able to do whatever they can to lessen harm. A very important fiqh principle, la darara wa la dirar. The Prophet of Allah said there should neither be harming nor the profligation of harm, the passing around and spreading of harm. And that's literally what a pandemic is. It's where people are becoming, without even realizing it sometimes, are contagious and are shedding the virus onto people that they come in contact with, including their loved ones. So whatever we can do to, one of the comments said, oh, the vaccine doesn't stop you being contagious. It certainly does. The vaccine, and Dr. Fasih can confirm this, it's not simply about treating symptoms, it's about preventing you from the virus from being able to take hold at a level that it's then contagious within you.
So, Sheikh Shafi, there's again, as ever, I really enjoy our discussions. There's always so much to reflect on. I want you to describe for me what the City Retreat, the mosque that you serve as the imam, what does a City Retreat look like post-pandemic? What does the next Ramadan, what does the next Eid Salah look like?
This is what we're really hoping for. Absolutely. Until 2020, every Ramadan for us as a community, because the retreat it's a masjid, it's a community center. It's not formally a masjid in the way that many of the other masajid are. So in a sense, we're a bit of a pop-up masjid, but at the same time, we're a very involved and engaging community center. And Ramadan is a time when our both floors, top and bottom floors, and now we have the cafe and the courtyard all decked out and ready to go. Ramadan's the time that all of that's heaving with life, and we have the iftar together, and people make Salatul Maghrib, men, women, young, old, children, elderly, and non-Muslims. People bring their non-Muslim friends and neighbors and colleagues along and to take part. All of that had to come to a grinding halt, and this Ramadan was very much a solitary one. Of course, silver linings. Some people have described this Ramadan as being their best ever because the focus had to be internal and personal. So that there's always, in adversity, there's always growth. Of course there is. But as a community, we need to be able to pick up. I, as an imam, have had to, just the amount of calls that we've had to respond to, and I'm just one, there are tens and hundreds of imams up and down the country who relay exactly the same experience. The amount of families who have reached out because, husband and wife are really struggling in their relationship because teenage children and parents tensions are really fraught. We're all being forced to be cooped up within the home for this lengthy period of time and being cut off from all of the usual social outlets. And that's having a huge detrimental impact on our, emotional and mental well-being, I think.
There's a beautiful comment in here. Someone said, going to Sheikh Shafi's circles at the City Retreat is like going home. And I can certainly say, somebody who's new to Leicester, I moved to Leicester just over a year ago. I've certainly felt at home at the City Retreat. And it's been a big loss, I think, to the community when the City Retreat has had to shut down or had to deliver very limited range of services. Abdul Karim, I assume that can only be the same story elsewhere in the other mosques across Leicester. Just in terms of these themes around the vaccine and what it will help us to do, what difference will it make to Masjid al-Falah and the other mosques under the umbrella of FMO?
Well, as Sheikh Chowdhury pointed out, actually, that yes, a vaccine is not the only solution, but it is part of the solution. And if it can speed up the process of bringing normality, I think we should all be delighted actually to see our mosque functioning with full-fledged and the madrasas operating on a full-fledged. And at the same time, if vaccine can help us in terms of safeguarding the well-being of those who are very vulnerable around us, then I think that is an added advantage. I consider it as an act of reward. And I think we must take it, and we must consider it positively and constructively. Having heard the debate here, and the clarity that has been offered, actually, I don't think we should remain in any kind of doubt that Muslim community has complied, and the masajid and our organizations have complied with the government guidance in a very high level, actually. And I think that has perhaps helped in terms of reducing the cases in some areas. And I think if we consider a vaccine as a positive way forward, and if we take it as one of the preventative measures, then perhaps that will be another contribution from our side in terms of bringing that normality quicker.
Inshallah. No, thank you, Jazakallah. That's very clear. I'm conscious of time. We are obviously running over, but we do have some questions to turn to. Just a couple of things I've picked up. Firstly, we are talking only about the Pfizer vaccine. There are some questions on AstraZeneca and Oxford. That isn't in scope today. We may have a future session on that once we've examined the contents of that vaccine and what that might mean for the Muslim community. Today is only about the Pfizer vaccine. I see some people have submitted questions to me directly. I might not be able to pick those up. So if you just put those in the sort of group chat, I'm going to direct these questions to the panel members I think they're most relevant for. Please do, all of you on the panel, sort of join in and respond as you feel appropriate. And hopefully you're okay with us just running perhaps until 9 o'clock to answer some questions from the community, from people who've been very patient for us to get to this portion of the session. Fasih, I'm going to come to you first. Do those who have already had COVID-19 need to be vaccinated? So if I've already had it and I've recovered, do I now need the vaccine?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I'm in that boat. I've had COVID. I've got positive antibodies because I've had it tested. And yes, I took the vaccine. And the reason for that is we don't know how long the immunity from the natural immunity from having the vaccine and developing the antibodies lasts for. There is an argument that it lasts for at least 6 months, but we don't know that. So my advice would be yes to take the vaccine, as I've taken it myself, but we don't know the answer, to that fully at this stage.
But the very clear imperative there, I think, is you may have had COVID, you may well have recovered from COVID. It doesn't mean that you'll be immune from getting it a second time, perhaps. So it's still better to be vaccinated than not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. A rather pointed question here, again for Dr. Fasih. We've heard some GPs are getting paid up to £12 per vaccine, and Pfizer are paying doctors to recommend and endorse the vaccine. So I guess the very obvious question for me is, how much money are you making off the back of this, and how much money are your colleagues making off the back of this?
Well, there we go. So complete fiction. I have nothing to do with Pfizer whatsoever. And I've mentioned a number of times already in this webinar that I appreciate that the pharmaceutical industry have a very poor history. We don't trust them at all, okay? What we trust is the data that was published and independently verified by a number of expert bodies. So I have nothing to do with Pfizer. Whether I support them, I reject them, I gain nothing, I lose nothing. As doctors, we are always skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, and every product that they try and sell to us, goes through a rigorous process. In terms of your other question about the £12.58 that GPs are making, I mean, I think this is quite sad that people are bringing this up, if I'm honest. I really find it quite sad. Let's just try and understand this. If you have a leak in your house and you call the plumber, do you expect him to do it for free? When you go and see the optician and for an eye check, do you expect to do it for free? These GPs are giving the vaccine. What does that actually involve? Well, a lot of it involves hiring extra facilities, a GP to oversee the vaccination process, nurses to administer the vaccine, admin staff to make sure that everything is going as planned. Then patients need to be observed. That all takes time. Time is equivalent to cost. You don't expect any work for free. So if GPs are going above and beyond to provide the vaccination above their contract, of course they'll be remunerated for this. There are much easier ways. I'm not a GP. So before somebody turns around and says, oh, I'm just supporting, I'm not a GP, okay? I'm a hospital physician. But GPs aren't going to do this for free if they're giving up their time and resources. They're getting paid a pittance. There was actually, and just to make this point, there was actually something that was published in the Pulse, which is a GP magazine, which showed that actually from this £12.58, GPs will barely break even for all the time and resources that they put in. It's not a money-making scheme. There are much easier ways for GPs to make money rather than administer a vaccine to people. Complete fiction, and makes me very sad, actually.
Well, I think that's a very genuine position, Dr. Fasih. I think anybody who knows you knows that you're not the first to leap to the defense of GPs necessarily, but very clear there in your response. Just out of interest, do GPs get paid for the flu vaccine?
They do. So the GPs do get, it's a similar amount, it's about £10, £11. So
this is not a new phenomenon. It's not new for COVID. This is just the way GPs are funded.
When you go to a GP to do a baby check, GPs get paid. When you go to the GPs for anything, blood pressure check at 1 year, you get paid. That's how the GP contract works. It's how much work you do, you get remunerated.
Shaykh Shafi, I want to bring you in there just on a related theme. We've all prayed in mosques up and down the country. Imams, as they should be, they're paid. Not enough, if you ask me. We attend classes of fiqh and hadith and Quran, and the instructors, the teachers, the imams, they are paid, as indeed they should be. Probably not enough. why do we struggle with this concept of the linkage of payment to something which can bring us good?
Yeah, I think again, so first of all, we assume that imams get paid. I know very many who
they should be paid.
end up doing what they do for the goodness of their heart because of the community, and our community has some very unrealistic expectations of public service. If you're doing it to help, then don't expect to get paid. It's all going to happen in the akhirah, and this is very bizarre. This is bizarre for a faith community, again, that recognize the importance of balancing the needs of the here as well as the hereafter. The Quran literally, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. Don't become blindsided about your portion of the here and now, of the dunya. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً. To the point that the Islamic state, the Islamic political system, the Khalifa, the Bayt al-Mal was responsible for administering the costs of both healthcare professionals as well as the wages of our teachers, of our scholars, of our imams, of every segment of society, of our enlisted soldiers. You know, this is the idea that somehow if it's being done for the sake of Allah, which is fi sabilillah, that should equate to free sabilillah, that's very faulty thinking.
Sure. I don't know, Abdul Karim, if you want to add anything to that response.
No, I endorse the views of Sheikh Chowdhury in terms of, if people are providing their services and if they are actually using their own time and resources, I don't see anything wrong in actually paying or getting remunerated for that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very clear.
Imran, can I also just quickly jump
course.
in to make a point? Again, one of these, sadly, far too many conspiracy things that are being circulated makes really a big song and dance about this £12.50, whatever it is, and then goes on to make a direct correlation with BIMA and casting really awful aspersions on BIMA. BIMA aren't all GPs, guys. Not every doctor is a GP. Like Dr. Fasih here, the vast majority of our may work in hospital medicine. They're not in your GP surgery. They're not looking at making sure that everyone's getting vaccinated. People have no dog in the fight. They have nothing to gain whatsoever other than your welfare, other than caring about the state of our community. They're not here hoping to cash in a £12 something check for every person who's going to click a link, because that's not how it works. It literally barely cuts even. Right, so it's just to make sure that the nurses, the admin, etc., as has been explained.
And it's really interesting because Dr. Fasih, referred to a baby check, right? So do we stop going to the GP for a baby check because there'll be some remuneration? Do we stop sending our children to school because the teachers are getting paid for teaching our children?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's such a fallacious argument. I think it's probably worth moving on at that point to the next question. Fasih, you've spoken in quite some detail about the gelatine factor, the pig content, the fetal cells. You've confirmed the vaccine doesn't contain any of that. There is a question asking whether it contains any metals, aluminium, barium, etc., or anything poisonous. Can you talk to us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, for sure. The Pfizer vaccine, and as we keep saying, we're speaking specifically about the Pfizer vaccine, not to say that the AstraZeneca one does, but the Pfizer one's the one that we've studied, does not contain any of the metals. It does not contain aluminium, does not contain barium, does not contain anything. The ingredients are available online. It's got the mRNA, it's got a lipid, which is fat around the mRNA, okay, which contains cholesterol and other fats, and it's got sugars and salts. Okay, naturally occurring, that can be found in the body anyway, and it's mixed with saline, which is basically salty water, and administered. No preservatives, no aluminium, no metals. And the question that I would ask at this point, which surprises me, I know I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent, but I'll keep it very, very brief. We have all this junk food, we're consuming nonsense, rubbish, day after day. We're taking medications which have a number of side effects. Nobody's bothered. Nobody cares. We're just filling ourselves up with all this rubbish. But all of a sudden, everybody seems to be really worried about the ingredients in the Pfizer vaccine. There is no aluminium. There's nothing to cause brain damage and all of this, fiction that's been spreading. The ingredients as I described.
Can you just summarize the ingredients again? I think that was really powerful, and I think the answer was very helpful. But can you just, for those listening in, summarize the ingredients again, please?
Of course. So we've got the genetic material, which is the mRNA. Yep. Around that, we have fats, what we call lipids in medical terms, which is made up of cholesterol and other naturally occurring fats. And we have sugars and salts. That's it.
Sheikh Shafi, I'm going to come back to you. I think this is really key, certainly for the community. I'm going to ask you the question I asked sort of half an hour ago. Is there anything in this vaccine that makes you uncomfortable from an Islamic perspective and its permissibility?
No, absolutely not. I'll tell you what does make me uncomfortable, though. It's people who will hear that, who can literally go online and read from official sources the list of ingredients, and then still say, like we have, you know, a chap here who's very vociferous in the chat group right here on our Zoom meeting. It is unsafe. It contains mercury or whatever. It's going a big, and then citing. There's a chap here who's been going on about, well, why didn't you refer to Dr. Rashid Battar? Right. Again, you know, I don't want to give. What about the World Alliance of somebody? Or these are people who have been, who have really unreputable and discredited individuals. People who have been either struck off or received disciplinaries because of their, you know, unethical practices and you know, scientific claims. And why? So I want to ask a question, which is, what is it that compels people to go against the body of reliably sourced and accessible information from reliable sources, to go against all of that and feel the need? And it's the same people who 1 minute they thought it was all about 5G, another time, and then when that was disproved, then it became another, the next, and then the next, and then the next. So really, and then they're demanding, prove me wrong when I say to you it contains mercury. Prove me wrong when I say to you it's going to change your DNA. And by the time you've got to the end of doing that, they've jumped onto another conspiracy theory. So the fundamental question is let's stop answering each and every quick conspiracy theory and just ask, why do you feel so compelled to be sucked into each and every one of these theories? What is it within us as individuals that's lacking, that makes us so distrustful? Because here's a real, you know, real speak, as they say, right? I want to put it, if you genuinely believe you live in a society where the international governments, the pharmaceutical industries, your medical professionals, the people, not some you know, faces on dissenting voices online from wherever, that they're not the people you go to when you have a heart murmur. They're not the people you go to when you're feeling unwell or sick. You're going to your local GP, your local NHS, A&E. They're the people you're going to, and yet you believe in this one instance they're all out to cause you great harm. And you believe this is a conspiracy that the government and the scientific community and medical community and pharmaceutical community are all collaborating in. Why are we still here?
Sheikh Shafi, I hate to answer a question with a question, but I'm going to do it on this occasion. So we've spoken before about healthy skepticism, about government, about anything institutional. So we know at one level it's healthy to raise some questions. We know to go to that extreme end and to question everything, to make everything into a conspiracy theory, is clearly unhealthy and it's wrong. As Muslims, how do we get the balance to make sure we're challenging appropriately and not just blindly following, but we're not challenging to a point and in a way that's irresponsible for ourselves and for others? How do we get that balance?
So I'm going to say something which a lot of people aren't going to like, potentially. The Prophet of Allah always urged staying with the vast majority. Alaykum bis-sawadi al-a'zam. Alaykum bis-sawadi al-a'zam. Stay with the greater majority. Now, historically and classically, this is, you know, in reference to religious matters and staying with the mainstream of the Muslim community, but also the mainstream of human society. And you can say, but the mainstream of society drink and they fornicate and they do. No, I'm not talking about doing all of those things. But I'm talking about life and death issues. There are people who, in anything to do with security and anything that induces fear, will always, you know, be the people who are scaremongering. be the people who are inducing panic and coming up with all sorts of some, you know, quite irrational things. So what do we do? What should we do as a community? We need to be going to the right sources of information. And the right source of information, again, if you don't believe these people are worthy to advise you medically, then please stop using the NHS. Genuinely, stop using the NHS. Stop going to any of you. And next time you feel poorly, write to Dr. Rashid Battar, email him. And when your mum needs, you know, or your grandparent need a bypass procedure, or somebody else is having issues with, speak to these, you know, alternate WACs.
I mean, this is a really good point. I mean, my grandma passed away a number of years ago, very sadly, but towards the end of her life, she had kidney failure. So she was on dialysis. Now, there was nobody in the family who was medically trained or qualified. So we put our trust in the doctors. We weren't there breaking down the ingredients of what was there in the dialysis process and how it worked. Now, I know it's a very different process, but the point you're making here, Sheikh Shafi, I think, is always go to the people of knowledge and stick with the majority.
Absolutely.
On that, sorry,
when the Quran, excuse me, just because some people are going to say, well, you know, the verse or the hadith I cited is in reference to the Muslim community. The Quran literally says to the Prophet, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, to the Prophet and the community and the Sahaba. And you can pick up Tabari, you can pick up classical tafsirs. Ahl al-Dhikr are the people of knowledge and expertise in their field, to the point, and Tabari bears this out, this can include the Jews and the Christians in affairs in which the Jews and the Christians are experts.
Just for the benefit of the audience here, so I guess Dabri's in reference to the famous Quran commentator,
absolutely,
qualified absolutely to provide commentary on the Quran and its meaning. So that's a really useful reference point. I just want to bring Abdul Karim in here. Sheikh Shafi's very clearly talked about staying with the majority. You represent a number of mosques across Leicester. You're in contact, I'm sure, with the imams on a daily basis. What are the imams of Leicester saying? Are they encouraging us to go for this vaccine? Are they comfortable with its contents from a permissibility perspective?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, at least I'm aware of a couple of organizations where on their website, they have clearly said actually that they approve and they endorse the views that is around. I haven't come across a single imam so far, I would say,
Wow,
who has actually opposed it or has raised any kind of doubt. I think we all agreed about the critical thinking and healthy skepticism, but otherwise, I would say that the majority of the ulemas, I think in the city, would be in favor.
I mean, this is remarkable. I think Sheikh Shafi again summarized it very well earlier, that if we were to not take this vaccine because we felt it was unsafe or haram in any way, we would be ignoring the advice of the majority of our local imams and the advice of the majority of our local medical professionals. And instead, we'd be blindly following the views of the random guy on WhatsApp or YouTube or wherever these videos and articles are being distributed. Dr. Fasih, I want to bring you back in for a couple of questions really around the medical perspective. There's a question on the long-term effects. You were very open, very honest, I felt earlier when you said the long-term effects clearly weren't absolutely established because we haven't had enough passage of time. How do you reconcile the fact that you're recommending the vaccine as a doctor, as a researcher in respiratory medicine, when you don't have that long-term data? How can you possibly recommend it?
Yeah, really good question. And I think this is the question that many people who are not keen to take the vaccine will have. And I think it's a great question. Look, everything in science is based on a hypothesis, okay? What we do is we look at the science, we understand how things work, how they don't work, and then that goes into clinical trials and is then proven or disproven, okay? Now, what do we know from years of research in vaccines and in medications and in everything science essentially based? The majority of side effects tend to happen in the first few weeks. So what we would have expected is that if there were side effects, I think over 1 million people have been vaccinated across the world now in the last month or so. If there were side effects that were significant, we've seen the allergy. That's a classic example of that. If there were other side effects, we would have seen them by now, okay? Now, that theoretically, of course, there still is a risk of long-term adverse events. But I think on the balance of probabilities, the risk benefit, and we keep talking about the balance of probabilities, in my opinion, and in the opinion of healthcare professionals, mainstream healthcare professionals across the globe, the benefits far outweigh the very, very small possibility that there will be long-term consequences. Very, very small possibility. And I, obviously, having taken the vaccine, I believe that. Having recommended the vaccine to my family and friends, I believe that. So this comes from a place of sincerity. We don't think that the vaccine will have long-term effects. But until we prove that in studies, which can take 5-10 years, and because if we wait 1 year, the argument will be, oh, what about in 5 years? You haven't waited long enough. So are we really going to wait for 10 years and remain in this pandemic in the hope?
No, sure. Sorry, I cut in there, but I'm going to ask you just very openly. Your father took the vaccine, I think you said last week. Did you think twice about that? On the morning that he was taking the vaccine, did you think, I better call Dad and say, don't go and take this vaccine? I'm really uncomfortable. How did you get comfortable with asking your 84-year-old father to take the vaccine?
I did not think twice, no. And this, for me, was the opportunity for him to be vaccinated, for the first step for normality to resume. It's a long process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not just everyone's going to be vaccinated and we're back to normal. I think we've talked about this. But actually, we were very excited. Dad's been very excited about this. In fact, his vaccine was changed by 2 days and he was quite upset. He wants to get his vaccine. He wants to get on with life, okay, eventually. So no, I didn't have second thoughts. As I keep saying, we take something like penicillin, an antibiotic. Do we know the long-term effects of penicillin? Has that been studied? Do we know the long-term effects of painkillers? Do we know the long-term effects of 95% of the things that we do? We don't have the same skepticism. Now, all of a sudden, we've become, long-term effects. Yes, we haven't shown that, but our science and our background and our education and our experience in this area tells us that the chances of that are absolutely minute. They are remote.
Can I just jump in to make a point, pick up on a point Dr. Fasih made excellently there. Doctors are usually the one when, Joe Public stream into GP surgeries demanding antibiotics for every little thing, and then complain, the GPs are trying to save money, they're not prescribing, the drugs I wanted or the antibiotics, whilst GPs are saying, for goodness sake, you don't need antibiotics. In fact, it's detrimental in the long term, both to the individual but to society at large, to have antibiotics flooding the community. So they're the ones who are usually applying the brakes. Here's a time where they're saying, yeah, this is fine actually, and for this pandemic that's altered all of our lives, impacted all of our lives, and suddenly everyone's become an expert in disease, infectious control management and long-term impacts. The very same people who usually complain that they're not getting the antibiotics that they demand the GP prescribe to them. So really, this is a very topsy-turvy situation.
I think that's a great point. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to just move it on to a couple of final questions. So, Dr. Fasih, you mentioned earlier that 2/3 of the patients in Leicester hospitals at this point in time were from a Bain background, Black and minority ethnic background. So one might assume that actually quite a lot of our Muslim communities, not all clearly, but quite a bit of the Muslim community in Leicester will also be of a Bain background. Why is it that the Bain community is perhaps disproportionately affected by COVID? And why does that perhaps make it more important that we take the vaccine seriously?
So the first thing to qualify here, when I say 2/3, of course, that's an approximation. It may be a little bit less than that, it may be a little bit more than that. But certainly there is a disproportionate number of Bain inpatient COVID inpatients than there are what we'd expect. Why are Bain communities disproportionately affected? I think we probably need a separate webinar on that. There's a whole host of hypotheses, theories. Is it due to genetics? Is it due to social cultural factors? Is it due to not following rules? Or there's a whole host, living in multi-generation households, congested areas, and so forth. That information hopefully will come out in the next few weeks and months, and I think it's beyond the remit of this webinar. But what clearly is apparent is that Bain are disproportionately affected. And if we're going to just mess around and try and quote X, Y, Z, you know, somebody's become an expert because they've read one article online which has no, you know, reputable source, then the only thing that's going to happen is this disproportionality is only going to increase. As the rest of the world, as everybody else gets vaccinated, if within our community we're still arguing about whether it contains aluminium or not, whether it still contains fetal cells, when the experts have told you it doesn't, then the only thing that's going to happen, our people will continue to contract COVID and our people will continue to die. So I think, you know, we really need to wake up as a community. We need to start listening to those individuals that are guiding us and actually take some responsibility for ourselves and our communities. Otherwise, we make the matter worse.
Thank you. That's very, very clear. I'm just conscious of time. I think we've been here for almost 2 hours, so I am going to bring it to a close. If we've not come to the question, it's only because of a limitation in time. We may have some follow-up sessions on further vaccines that may be rolled out over the weeks and months to come. But I think for today, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists. I'd like to invite them all for any final or concluding remarks before I summarize, and ask Abdul Karim also to summarize in Urdu for those listening who would prefer a summary in Urdu. So Dr. Fasih, any concluding remarks or any final points that you'd like to emphasize before we close?
One of the things that I think I would like to say is, I mean, I've just been following the chat box, and I mean, there's a lot of very interesting comments on there, but there's this notion that actually the survival rate is 99.9%. I mean, this is utter nonsense. Okay, this is not true. You know, the case fatality rate is probably around 1 or 2%. But just think about not just mortality, think about long COVID and all the consequences that we've discussed, okay? And look at everything together, the impact on society, the impact on all the other, on our mosques and so forth, and then realize the devastation of this disease. We are in a global pandemic, which is going to cause a recession like no other. If the survival was as high as 99.9%, there was no other issues, nobody would be closing doors, okay? So that's the point that I want to get across. I think my closing statement otherwise is there is a lot for people to consider. I appreciate people are feeling overwhelmed, but as we've said, you trust us. You trust us when you come to us with your pneumonias, your heart attacks, your burst appendix, your road traffic accidents, and so forth. Please trust us. We're all very happy to engage in discussion. Come to us with genuine questions, not preaching as experts, and we will always entertain discussion with you and try and reassure you. And if at the end of that, you decide that having considered the risk benefit that you don't want to take vaccine, that's absolutely fine, but please do not spread misinformation. Please do not spread information that will result in the death of others who will listen to that and follow your advice. Jazakallah khair.
Very powerful. Thank you, Dr. Fasih. So Sheikh Shafi, any concluding or final remarks from you?
I just want to say, you know, we as a community, Muslims, are used to being sometimes, you know, feeling that we're in the minority, feeling that we are being stigmatized for all sorts of things. And so it's natural to develop a bit of a contrarian streak, to have a bit of resilience, to question the narrative. And so that comes from a rational place, a reasonable place. But don't be contrarian to the point that now, because, and I've said this previously, there are people who are still saying it's a hoax, it's not real. If you genuinely believe this, you have to ask yourself, if your conspiracy theory were true, why are you still walking around in this country, in society, where world governments have colluded with your medical healthcare experts, with everybody else, with your scholars, everyone's been bought, and they're all out to try to persuade you, not force you. The army's not knocking down your door to deliver the vaccine. They're saying, actually, guys, this is it's medically proven that this is an issue we need to take seriously. We've seen what happens in our community. We've buried far too many of our dead. So please stop with the nonsense talk. It's not, you know, if some people, it's always fashionable, always to be edgy, to be questioning the official narrative. But there's a limit, you know, and the limit is somewhere around the line when you've buried within your own community, within your family and friends, far too many people of all ages. There comes a point that we have to take this seriously. So let's not just be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian.
Abdul Karim, any final comments?
I think both members have already actually pointed out very clearly that the situation that we are talking about is real, is very serious, and I think we should go for the trusted sources for information and advice rather than taking it from some of the completely unscientific sources and unreliable sources. I think the information that we try to digest must be from the professionals, from the experts, scientific community, and that's what I think we need to go for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So a huge thank you from me. I think we were supposed to go on for an hour and a half, not only to the panelists, but I think we've still got over 80 dedicated members on the Zoom link. So it's clearly a topic which is of great interest, and hopefully it's brought clarity amidst the confusion and some of the information that has caused confusion in the public domain. I just wanted to sort of really summarize with 4 points. I'll ask Abdul Karim then to provide a summary in Urdu. I think we started by talking about our responsibility as Muslims and as people of society here in Leicester. We heard very clearly from Shaykh Shafi that we all have a duty to access and share information in a responsible way from accurate and qualified sources. We also have a duty to keep ourselves and our community safe. We heard very clearly from Dr. Fasih how we should support the effort to achieve herd immunity. We heard very clearly then from Abdul Karim and from Shaykh Shafi the impact this will have. The mosques will open again. We can visit our parents openly. Hopefully we can welcome Ramadan and future Eid prayers in the normal way that we did pre-pandemic. And that really brings me on to our community. We are, most of us, or the majority of us, from a Bain background. We heard from Dr. Fasih again very clearly. The Bain community is amongst the hardest hit by COVID. And if we don't take the vaccine, we will remain the hardest hit and the most impacted. We spoke to Shaykh Shafi about our Islamic tradition. Dr. Fasih clarified very clearly that it does not contain any human cells, nor does it contain any animal cells. And Shaykh Shafi was incredibly clear on this point. The vaccine is absolutely permissible from an Islamic perspective, a position that was supported by Abdul Karim, indeed supported by the majority of imams and by the mosques under the umbrella organization of FMO. We went on to talk about safety. Is the vaccine safe? Will it keep us safe? The evidence we had from Dr. Fasih and the data that he has reviewed personally, the journals that he has reviewed and colleagues of his have also reviewed, confirms the vaccine is safe. Dr. Fasih has recommended this vaccine to his 84-year-old father. The vaccine is safe. As always, please consult your GP. It is about your individual, your personal medical history and what is relevant for you. Please have that conversation, make the right decision for you, for your families, and for your communities. Thank you all so much for your time. It really has been a privilege to host 3 experts and spend this time together online. I certainly am praying for an end to this pandemic so that I can meet these 3 great people in person and hopefully share more ideas around how we can support the community. There's a final request from me before I hand over to Abdul Karim. A very dear friend of mine by the name of Razwan Faraz in Birmingham. Both of his parents were admitted to hospital yesterday with COVID. His father, very sadly, is in ICU. He is in an induced coma. He is on a ventilator. I ask you very sincerely, please remember him and his parents in your prayers. He's a very dear friend, a very dear brother, a fabulous family. If we can all please pray for their health, for their safety and their well-being, inshallah. Abdul Karim.
मैं समझता हूँ कि अब ज़्यादा बात करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है। इसके बावजूद भी चूँकि हमें ये बताया गया है कि आप थोड़ा सा उर्दू में बात कर लें। भाई इमरान साहब ने ये बताया कि पूरी डिस्कशन जो है हमारी शुरू से इस बात के ऊपर रही कि हमारी जिम्मेदारी क्या होती है इनफरादी तौर पर और इज्तिमाई तौर पर। इनफरादी तौर पर हमारी जिम्मेदारी ये ज़रूर होती है कि हम खुद भी जो है इन चीज़ों से, इन बीमारी से महफूज रहें और दूसरे लोग भी इनसे इस बीमारी से बचे उसके लिए कोशिश करें। और इसीलिए ये सारा जो हम लोग बात करते हैं मास्क पहनने का, सोशल डिस्टेंसिंग का, ये सारा इसी वजह से है। वैक्सीन के बारे में बहुत ज़्यादा बातचीत हुई और इसमें सबसे बड़ी खुशनसीबी हमारी ये है कि हमारे साथ जो हैं इमाम शेख चौधरी और हमारे साथ डॉक्टर फसीह खान जो हैं, جو کہ ایکسپرٹ سمجھے جاتے ہیں اس فیلڈ کے اندر، یہ ہمارے ساتھ تھے، اور انہوں نے بہت ڈیٹیلز کے ساتھ جو ہے ہمیں یہ سمجھایا کہ یہ ویکسین جو ہے سیف ہے، یہ حلال ہے، اس میں کوئی ہیومن یا اینیمل سیلز نہیں ہے، اور یہ ایک پریونٹیو میجر کی ایک کوشش ہے کہ ہم اس سے جو ہے کووڈ سے بچ سکے۔ تو اس لیے جو ہے پھر انہوں نے جو ہے یہ بھی بتایا کہ ہم نے یہ بھی سنا کہ ہماری جتنی بڑی آرگنائزیشن ہے، جیسے مسلم کاؤنسل آف بریٹن، برٹش اسلامک میڈیکل ایسوسیشن ہے، میناب ہے، BBSI ہے، لوکلی ہمارا FMO ہے، اور دوسرے بہت سارے ہمارے ائمہ حضرات اور مساجد اور ان کی ویب سائٹ ہمیں یہ کہہ رہی ہے کہ یہ ویکسین سیف ہے، اس میں کوئی حرام کا ایلیمنٹ نہیں ہے، اور ہمیں اسے جو ہے اپنے آپ کو محفوظ رکھنے کے لیے، اپنے گھر والوں کو محفوظ رکھنے کے لیے، ہمارے بڑی عمر کے رشتہ داروں کو محفوظ رکھنے کے لیے، اور کمیونٹی میں ایسے لوگ جو کہ ونریبل سمجھے جاتے ہیں، بیمار سمجھے جاتے ہیں، ان کو محفوظ رکھنے کے لیے ہمیں یہ ویکسین کو استعمال کرنا چاہیے۔ ہو سکتا ہے انشاءاللہ کہ اس کی وجہ سے اگر یہ بیماری جلد ختم ہو جائے تو پھر سے دوبارہ ہماری مساجد اور مدرسے اور ہماری دینی جو ہیں دوسری آرگنائزیشن جلدی سے کھل جائے، ہم ہر نارمالٹی کی طرف جلدی سے آگے بڑھ جائے۔ جزاک اللہ خیر، شکریہ۔
Jazakallah, thank you, Abdul Karim. Sheikh Shafi, can I ask you just to close the session with a short prayer, and then we can end the session after that, inshallah.
جزاكم الله خيرا. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله تعالى وسلم على خير خلق نبينا محمد وأزواجه وذريته ومن بهداهم اقتدى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وعملا صالحا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم نفس كرب المكروبين وفرج هم المهمومين وفك أسر المأسورين واشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وتقبل في الشهداء قتلانا يا أرحم الراحمين، وعاف مبتلانا يا كريم يا رحيم يا منان يا رؤوف. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في ديننا ودنيانا وأهلنا ومالنا. اللهم استر عوراتنا وآمن روعاتنا. اللهم احفظنا من بين أيدينا ومن خلفنا وعن أيماننا وعن شمائلنا ومن فوقنا، ونعوذ بعظمتك أن نغتال من تحتنا يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. جزاكم الله خير.